The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Megan O'Brien reorganized the medication dispensary with mechanical precision, her hands moving through the motions they had performed 6 nights a week for the past 18 months. Cedar Creek Medical's 4th floor fell silent around 2 in the morning, that dead zone between the evening shift's chaos and the dawn rush, when the hospital felt like a ship running on skeleton crew. The smell of stale coffee mixed with antiseptic hung in the air, clinging to her scrubs like a second skin. She didn't look up when footsteps approached, she never did, but she heard them. Dr. Caldwell, moving with the particular confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. The cold stainless steel of the medication cart gleamed under the harsh white light as she continued her work, counting tablets, verifying dosages, checking the computerized logs against physical inventory. 3 years of night shifts in trauma centers before Cedar Creek had taught her that invisibility was a choice, and she chose it every single shift. Nobody on the day shift knew her name. Nobody in administration had requested her specifically. She was the kind of nurse that hospitals ran on and never acknowledged, competent enough that problems didn't happen, quiet enough that nobody remembered to look. Her hands had held Marines' hearts together outside Tikrit 7 years ago. They had applied tourniquets to bleeding stumps while Black Hawk screamed overhead. They had performed emergency field surgery in the back of a Humvee with nothing but a trauma kit and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. But those hands were supposed to be someone else's now. Those hands belonged to a dead woman. The tarnished challenge coin sat heavy in her scrub pocket, pressed against her ribs like a secret she couldn't afford to tell. It had been forged from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel the day she pulled 3 Marines from a burning vehicle on the outskirts of Tikrit, names she still saw when she closed her eyes. Rodriguez. Chen. That kid from Kentucky whose name nobody could pronounce. The coin itself was worthless, a piece of warped metal that would never buy anything, never impress anyone who mattered. But it was proof. It was evidence that Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had existed. And if anyone here discovered that proof, the investigation would collapse. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to be forgettable. Dr. Caldwell swept the patient charts off the nurse's station in a motion that looked almost casual, though she recognized it for what it was, practiced, choreographed, designed for maximum humiliation. The manila folders scattered across Cedar Creek Medical's polished floor like autumn leaves, spreading across the hallway in a theatrical cascade. He smiled, that particular smile that men in power perfected, the kind that cracked their face without touching their eyes. "Pick those up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the entire 4th floor staff to hear him. Loud enough for the residents trailing him to register the moment as entertainment. Loud enough for the 2 night shift orderlies restocking the linen cart to pause and watch. Loud enough for the data entry clerk at the far desk to glance up from her computer screen. Megan didn't react. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply set down the medication she'd been holding, turned toward the scattered charts, and knelt to gather them. One by one. Room for 06. Room for 08. Room for 10. Room for 12, that was General Marcus Hayes, 4-star command structure, Special Forces liaison, the patient whose medical records had first flagged the billing irregularities that brought her here 18 months ago. The patient whose son served under Hayes in Tikrit. Her son. The mission had always been simple: document the overbilling scheme targeting wounded veterans, compile evidence against the hospital administration, and wait for the federal investigators to move in. Stay invisible. Stay professional. Don't react. She picked up the last chart without meeting Caldwell's eyes, rose to her feet, and turned back to the nurse's station. Her movements were economical, purposeful, the kind of motion that suggested nothing had happened at all. The resident seemed disappointed. Caldwell's smile flickered, the quickest of pauses, a micro-expression of irritation that his script hadn't played out the way he expected. He'd been waiting for tears, or anger, or the visible breaking of someone beneath him. He got nothing. "You're new to our department," Caldwell continued, moving closer now, his voice still pitched for an audience. "How long have you been here? A year? Must be feeling the strain. Night shifts really aren't for everyone." He turned to the residents, his tone shifting to that particular brand of false concern that physicians used when they wanted to exclude someone. Nursing can be exhausting. High burnout rates. Statistics show most new hires in night shift positions leave within their first 2 years. Megan organized the charts back into their proper order, verifying the room numbers against each spine. She could feel Caldwell watching her, waiting for some indication that his words had landed. The 4th floor was almost silent except for the distant beeping of a cardiac monitor from one of the rooms, the ventilator's mechanical wheeze from another, the hum of the HVAC system cycling through the hallway vents. "You know what," Caldwell announced, turning fully toward his audience now, "I bet you a week's salary you won't last another 7 days in this position. What do you think, gentlemen? The night shift gets to most of them." One of the residents laughed, a nervous sound that evaporated in the fluorescent-lit silence. Caldwell's confidence was the kind that came from institutional power, from knowing that boards answered to him and accreditation committees took his word as gospel. He was the kind of man who'd learned that humiliation was a tool, that public degradation was how hierarchies stayed in place, that people responded to pressure and shame in predictable ways. What Caldwell didn't know was that the quiet night shift nurse reorganizing medications with mechanical precision was conducting a classified investigation into his hospital's overbilling scheme. That the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket had been earned through actions that would never appear in any official record. That the hand steadying the medication cart had once held a 4-star general's heart together while shrapnel fell from the sky. That the woman he'd just humiliated in front of an audience had been trained by the United States Navy to operate under pressure so extreme it had a name, the breaking point. She simply continued her work, sorting and cataloging, verifying and documenting, while Caldwell waited for a response that never came. His frustration was almost visible now, that particular annoyance of a predator discovering that the mouse wasn't playing the game according to his rules. In room for 12, General Marcus Hayes lay in the hospital bed, recovering from surgery. He was the reason she was here. He was the reason she'd spent 18 months invisible on a hospital floor instead of doing what Master Chiefs actually did. His command structure included her son's unit, the men and women who depended on his decisions, and his medical bills had been inflated by over $200,000 through fraudulent billing practices that targeted wounded special forces. Every fake procedure, every duplicated charge, every inflated cost that got coded into his insurance claim represented money taken from soldiers who'd already paid with pieces of themselves. Caldwell finally turned away, satisfied that he'd made his point, that he'd established the hierarchy in a way that would be remembered. The residents followed him down the hallway like satellites orbiting a dying star, their conversation resuming with forced casualness. The night shift settled back into its rhythm. The monitors continued their steady beeping. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath. And Megan O'Brien, still folding patient charts and refilling medication dispensaries, touched the challenge coin in her pocket once, a gesture so small that nobody could have seen it, a moment of contact so brief it lasted less than a heartbeat. She had survived worse than a cardiologist's contempt. She had dragged bleeding men across desert sand under fire. She had made decisions that cost lives and saved others in the same breath. But she was supposed to be invisible, and invisibility meant never showing the cracks, never letting the mask slip, never giving anyone the satisfaction of knowing that beneath the nurse's scrubs and the forgettable face and the mechanical precision of a night shift caregiver existed something far more dangerous than any of them could imagine. The fluorescent lights hummed. The hospital breathed. And somewhere in room for 12, a 4-star general slept, unaware that his recovery depended on a woman who'd already saved his life once before, and would do it again before this was over. The hospital cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and something that had been reheated too many times. Megan carried her lunch tray through the crowded dining room, navigating between tables where clusters of doctors laughed too loudly about cases they shouldn't be discussing. She'd chosen a corner seat, the kind of spot that let her observe without being observed. Muscle memory from 2 decades of field work. Always know the exits. Always control the sightlines. Dr. Caldwell was at the center table, holding court with 3 board members, Sterling, Hayes, and Bennett. Men with 6-figure bonuses tied directly to Cedar Creek Medical's billing margins. Men who'd grown comfortable with the phantom charges, the inflated procedures, the systematic overbilling of wounded veterans' insurance claims. Caldwell was mid-story, gesturing with theatrical flair, when he spotted Megan settling into her seat with a container of grilled chicken and rice. He stood abruptly. Deliberately. Our night shift nurse, he called across the cafeteria loud enough for 40 people to hear. Come join us, won't you? Megan didn't look up. Acknowledgement meant engagement. Engagement meant visibility. Caldwell moved toward her table anyway, his white coat flapping behind him like a cape. Actually, I was thinking about you this morning. Making a prediction, really? He smiled at the board members trailing behind him. I'd say you have 1 week. Maybe 2 before you realize you don't have what it takes for this work. The cafeteria noise dropped by half. People were watching now. 1 week, he repeated, addressing the audience he'd created. I'm willing to stake $50 on it. Anyone else? Sterling laughed. Bennett's eyes gleamed with the particular pleasure of someone watching a superior bully someone lower in the hierarchy. Megan kept eating. 1 bite. 2 bites. Her jaw moved with mechanical precision, processing food the way a machine processes input. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Years of training had taught her that visible emotion was a weapon in the hands of people like Caldwell. So she showed him nothing. Not much of a gambler. Caldwell pressed, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. That's okay. Most people who work night shift aren't really equipped for the higher cognitive demands of daytime medicine anyway. Still nothing. Megan took another bite. The rejection of his bait seemed to irritate him. He lingered a moment longer, then drifted back to his table, already recalibrating. The cafeteria slowly resumed its normal volume, but people kept glancing at Megan. They'd seen her not react. That was unusual. Most nurses either flushed red or retreated. Most nurses tried to defend themselves. This one simply continued eating, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her face blank as a freshly wiped whiteboard. 3 days later, Caldwell found her at the medication cart on the 4th floor. It was late evening, the shift change moment when the floor was busiest but also most exposed. Megan was checking dosages against patient charts when Caldwell approached carrying his tray from the cafeteria. Without preamble, without warning, he swept his arm across the counter in front of her. Her tray went airborne. The container of soup arced through the air in slow motion before splattering across the polished floor in a spreading stain of broth and vegetables. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Caldwell said immediately, his voice pitched high with theatrical concern, grabbing her arm as if steadying her after a shock. Are you all right? That was completely my fault. I feel terrible. 3 residents had stopped to watch. 2 nurses. A nursing assistant. Megan looked at the spill. She looked at Caldwell's hand still gripping her arm. She looked at the assembled audience. Then she gently extracted her arm and reached for paper towels from the dispenser. She began wiping up the mess without speaking, her movements efficient and controlled. A small muscle in her jaw tightened once, a barely perceptible clenching, and then released. Let me help, Caldwell offered, making a show of assisting. Really, I feel awful. She worked around him, saying nothing. When the floor was clean, Caldwell placed a hand on her shoulder. You know, you have real potential here. Don't let one little accident shake your confidence. Happens to everyone. Megan disposed of the paper towels. She returned to the medication cart and resumed checking dosages without acknowledging him or his words. It was the kind of quiet that could have shattered glass if glass was close enough to break. Caldwell watched her for a moment, clearly irritated by the refusal to engage, then departed. But as he passed the nurse's station, something shifted in his posture. The frustration transformed into something colder. Calculation. He'd tried to provoke her, and she hadn't reacted. That meant she was either remarkably composed or remarkably unbothered by his presence. Either way, the direct approach wasn't working. That night, from his office on the administrative level, Caldwell made 3 phone calls. The first was to Sterling, one of the board members. "I need you to call Mercy General and Seattle General. Ask about that nurse I mentioned. Megan O'Brien. Night shift worker. I'm running a quiet credential check because I've noticed some discrepancies in her work history." The lie came easily. Just routine due diligence. Sterling agreed without hesitation. The 3 board members had been enriched by Cedar Creek's billing practices to the tune of roughly $80,000 each over the past 18 months. They would do whatever Caldwell asked. This was the nature of their arrangement. The second call was to a private investigator named Morrison, a man who specialized in credential verification. Caldwell had used him before on other matters that required a veneer of legitimacy. "I need a background investigation on a staff nurse. Name's O'Brien. Megan. I want anything unusual. Educational gaps, employment inconsistencies, anything that suggests she might not be who she claims to be." Morrison had done this work dozens of times. He didn't ask why. The retainer was $1,500 for preliminary work, and Caldwell authorized it without hesitation. Money that would come from hospital funds misallocated as consulting fees. The third call was to a contact at the state nursing board. Just a conversation. Just a suggestion that someone on the Cedar Creek Medical night shift might be operating outside the scope of her license. That there might be medications being administered without proper oversight. Nothing concrete. Nothing provable. Just a seed planted in the right ear. By the time Megan finished her shift at 6 in the morning, Caldwell had activated a network that would begin to close around her like a fist. 3 board members with financial incentive to protect him. An outside investigator with authorization to dig into her past. A complaint filed with regulatory authorities that would require a response and investigation. A narrative being constructed, piece by piece, that would explain her termination when the time came. He sat in his office as dawn light filtered through the windows. On his desk lay General Marcus Hayes's file. Room for 12. A 4-star patient who'd been shot in the abdomen during an operation near Tikrit and was now recovering under Cedar Creek Medical's care. The same general whose nephew Hayes had personally sent to his death in a firefight 3 years ago by ignoring intelligence briefings. An inconvenient truth that had been buried under classified reports and military bureaucracy. Caldwell didn't know that Megan O'Brien had pulled those reports. Didn't know she'd been investigating the connection between his overbilling scheme and the specific targeting of wounded Special Forces personnel. Didn't know that her presence on his night shift wasn't coincidence, it was mission assignment. What he did know was that she represented a threat to his arrangement. And threats, in Caldwell's experience, could be neutralized if you had the right leverage and the right network. He smiled and made a note on his calendar for 1 week out. Termination for cause. Gross negligence. Procedural violations. The narrative would be airtight by then. The network would ensure it stuck. On the 4th floor of Cedar Creek Medical, Megan folded her scrubs into her locker and prepared for sleep. The tarnished challenge coin in her pocket pressed against her ribs like a secret. Like a promise. Like a deadline ticking down toward something neither of them could yet see. The building hummed with the white noise of ventilators and machines and the endless work of keeping people alive. And somewhere in room for 12, General Marcus Hayes slept, recovering from a surgery that would have killed him if the night shift nurse hadn't been standing in the right place at the right moment. She'd already saved his life once. The real crisis hadn't even begun. The code blue alarm shrieked at 2:02 a.m., and Megan was already moving before the first wail died. General Hayes' cardiac monitor flatlined into a single accusatory tone. Ventricular fibrillation. The general's chest rose once more on the ventilator, then went still. She was in the operating room before the trauma surgeon even set down his coffee. Dr. Patterson looked up from his chart, eyes confused. Megan didn't ask permission. She grabbed the sterile field, prepped his chest in 4 seconds, and the attending watched her hands move with the absolute certainty of someone who'd done this before, countless times, under conditions that made a surgical suite look like a luxury hotel. 14-gauge needle. Now. Her voice had dropped an octave. No, please. No apology for the presumption. Patterson hesitated. That hesitation nearly killed him. Do it, Megan said. Not a request. A command. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. O2 sat climbing. 68, 72. 79. The monitor picked up a rhythm, weak, irregular, but a rhythm. She didn't celebrate. She moved to the next step. Scalpel. I need a number 10. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. Her hands were already in position, already reading the anatomy beneath her fingertips like a map she'd memorized in blood. The blade went through skin and muscle and fascia in one fluid motion, and there it was, the general's heart, still and failing inside the pericardium. Megan opened the sac. Blood and fluid spilled across the surgical drape. She didn't flinch. She slid her fingers into the chest cavity and felt the heart in her palm, that extraordinary, terrible, familiar weight of another human's mortality compressed into muscle and chambers and electrical pulses that had gone silent. She squeezed. Once. Twice. The direct cardiac massage, taught in no textbook anymore, obsolete for 15 years, the kind of procedure you only knew because you'd learned it in combat medicine under fire, because you'd done it on a Marine named Santiago whose Humvee had taken shrapnel outside Tikrit, and you'd kept squeezing his heart even after you knew it was too late, because you didn't stop. Not ever. Not until someone told you to. Blood pressure coming up, the anesthesiologist whispered. 60/40. 65/45. 72/50. O2 climbing. 82, 88. 92, stable. Patterson was staring at her hands. Not her face. Her hands. The hands of a woman who was supposed to be organizing medications at a medication cart, not conducting open cardiac massage like she was born doing it. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The surgical nurse was frozen. Residents in the doorway had stopped breathing. One of them was writing something in his phone. Megan didn't care. She cared about the rhythm. The numbers. The general's life sitting in her palm while his heart learned to beat again. Epinephrine. 1 milligram for push, she said. Check the rhythm. They did. Normal sinus rhythm. 62 beats per minute. The monitor showed a perfect electrical pattern, steady as a metronome. The general's pupils were already reactive. Perfusion was adequate. He was going to live. Megan was still holding his heart when she smelled it, that particular bite in the air, sharp and wrong, the chemical signature of a gas leak. Propine. The olfactory alarm bell that every person trained in tactical medicine learns to recognize because it means fire is coming. She'd smelled this exact signature once before, outside a forward operating base in Helmand Province, exactly 42 seconds before an IED detonated. 42 seconds. She didn't announce it. She didn't waste breath on protocol. Her left hand was still supporting the general's heart. Her right hand moved to shield his open chest cavity. The surgical nurses were still documenting vitals. Patterson was still staring at her hands. Nobody else had smelled it yet. 38 seconds. Get out, she said to the room. Quiet. Absolute. Excuse me. Patterson looked up. Gas leak. Surgical wing. Everyone out. Now. 32 seconds. The anesthesiologist checked the wall. Yes, he smelled it now. His eyes went wide. He started calling it in. Patterson started moving people. The residents in the doorway were already backing away, already understanding at some primal level that this woman who'd just performed impossible cardiac surgery in street clothes knew something they didn't. 26 seconds. Megan didn't move. Not from the general's chest. She kept her hand exactly where it was, supporting his heart, keeping the rhythm going, feeling the electrical pulses return to normal under her fingertips. The general's pupils tracked toward her face. Not unconscious. He was hearing this. Understanding it. 19 seconds. "General," she said. "Stay with me." 14 seconds. The surgical lamp directly above them flickered. Twice. The electrical surge that happened before a gas explosion when the line ruptures and spreads through the walls, seeking an ignition source. 8 seconds. Megan moved her entire body over General Hayes' open chest cavity. Not a dive. Not a dramatic flourish. A complete conscious decision made in the time it takes to breathe once. She folded herself over him like a shield, her torso covering the exposed surgical field, her arms wrapped around the operating table, her face turned away from the direction the explosion would come from. 1 second. The surgical wing imploded. Not exploded, imploded, the gas igniting in a compressed ball of heat and pressure and fury. The operating room wall came inward as if something had grabbed it and crumpled it like paper. The surgical lamp exploded into a shower of glass and sparks. The overhead lights flickered once and died. Shrapnel, hot and vicious and moving at velocities that turned steel into weapons, tore through the operating room. The blast hit Megan across the back of the shoulders and legs like the entire force of a bomb had decided to concentrate itself into one focused punishment for her exposed flesh. She didn't scream. The sound that came out of her was involuntary, the full-body response to catastrophic trauma, but she didn't scream. Her arms stayed locked around the general. Her body stayed in place over his open chest. "I've got you," she whispered. "I've got you." Patterson had been thrown backward against the wall. The surgical nurses had been blown through the doorway and were already screaming for help. The anesthesiologist was on the ground bleeding from his shoulder. The residents had disappeared into the hallway, their voices joining the orchestrated chaos of a hospital suddenly in its own trauma state. But Megan didn't move. Not until the orderlies came in. Not until they told her to stand up, that she needed to let them stabilize the general, that she had to go to triage herself. Not until someone gently, so gently, tried to move her away from the table and she realized her legs weren't working. She looked down. Blood. Too much of it. The shrapnel had taken both of her lower legs, clean below the knee, the cauterization from the heat already preventing worse hemorrhage. Her scrubs were soaked. The floor was soaked. But the general's heart was still beating. Still strong. Still alive. "Get him to ICU," she said. "Full trauma protocol. Page cardiothoracic. He's stable, but I want eyes on that pericardium every 10 minutes. Nurse, we need to." I said get him to ICU. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The voice of someone who'd given orders on the battlefield and expected them to be executed without question. The orderlies didn't debate it. They moved. They got the general stabilized. They wheeled him out. Megan sat on the floor of the surgical suite, legs folded beneath her, covered in blood that wasn't entirely hers, and waited for someone to tell her what happened next. The surgical suite smelled like copper and burnt plastic. Megan sat on the tile floor with her legs folded beneath her, covered in blood that wasn't entirely hers, and waited for someone to tell her what happened next. Silence pressed down like a physical weight. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from the adjacent room where they'd wheeled General Hayes. Somewhere above, fluorescent lights hummed their endless drone. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Everything about her was steady except for the fact that her legs no longer obeyed the signals her brain was sending them. A nurse found her there at 3:14 a.m. Not rushing. Not panicking. Just sitting. "Megan, you need to," the nurse started, then saw the legs and the blood and whatever else was visible beneath the surgical lights, and stopped speaking entirely. By 4:22 a.m., Megan was in the ICU recovery bay with bilateral amputations below the knee, 3 units of packed red cells, a titanium plate in her left scapula, and 37 stitches holding her back together where the ceiling had tried to rearrange her architecture. The anesthesia pulled her under like a current. When she surfaced, dawn was breaking grey and cold through the ICU window, and Dr. Caldwell was already moving. The board members called at 6:19 a.m. 3 phone calls, precisely coordinated, each one reaching a different member of Cedar Creek Medical's governing committee. Unauthorized procedures. Deviation from protocol. Patient endangerment through unilateral decision-making. The language was clinical and lethal. By 7:33 a.m., those 3 board members had activated their own network, a call to the hospital administrator, a message to risk management, a preliminary recommendation for immediate suspension pending investigation. Caldwell had prepared these contacts months ago, back when he realized that Megan's questions about the cardiovascular department's billing patterns were growing too specific, too dangerous. He'd loaded the weapons. He was simply pulling the trigger now. At 8:15 a.m., an outside investigator arrived at Cedar Creek Medical with a leather portfolio and a predetermined bias. Caldwell had retained this man for exactly this purpose, someone with investigative credentials who could be trusted to find whatever Caldwell needed him to find. The investigator's assignment was simple: review Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien's personnel file and provide a written assessment of her clinical competence, with particular attention to any deviation from standard protocols or evidence of unauthorized decision-making during the Hayes emergency. The investigator had been paid $4,500 for this assignment. Caldwell had been laundering hospital funds for years. Another $4,500 was nothing. By 9:40 a.m., telephone calls were being made to nursing schools. The investigator was digging through her file. Caldwell's phone was pressed to his ear, and he was speaking in hushed tones to someone at the state nursing board, a colleague he'd known for 15 years, someone whose daughter had benefited from a scholarship that Caldwell's foundation had discreetly funded. "I'm concerned about some historical medication discrepancies," Caldwell was saying, his voice heavy with regret. "I don't want to make accusations, but if there's an audit trail, it might be worth examining." There was no audit trail. There were no medication discrepancies. But the implication was enough. It would plant questions. It would create shadow doubt in places where doubt would be useful to him. Megan heard none of this from her ICU bed. The morphine was still dominant in her system, dragging her consciousness down into a fog where pain was information and information was distant. But at 2:51 p.m., the hospital administrator came to her room with 2 security guards standing outside the door like punctuation marks, and he delivered the message in a voice that was trying very hard to sound professional and failing to sound anything except final. "Master Chief O'Brien," he said, and the use of her rank sounded like someone quoting from a script they didn't understand, "effective immediately, your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated. The reasons include gross negligence, procedural violations during the emergency surgery, and unauthorized medical intervention that placed our patient at additional risk. We've received multiple complaints from the investigative team, and risk management has concluded that your continued employment creates liability." He held a folder in his hands like it was evidence. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to the address on file. We'll need your badge and credentials returned within 48 hours. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Megan's eyes were still half closed, pupils massive from the medication, but something in her face didn't change. No flinch. No protest. No question. She simply nodded once, a movement that cost her nothing because she was already beyond the point where anything could cost her more than she'd already paid. The administrator waited for her to say something, an apology, a defense, a plea, but she just stared at the ceiling where the light reflected off the white acoustic tiles in patterns that looked like Morse code if you were high enough on morphine to believe that God was sending messages in fluorescent white. 3 days later, when the surgical pain had settled into a baseline that could be managed with lower doses of medication, her 16-year-old son Ryan came through the door of her hospital room carrying a cardboard box. His face was the color of cement. His hands were shaking in a way that suggested he'd been given information that his young brain was still trying to process. Inside the box were her personal belongings from her locker. A photograph of Ryan in his junior ROTC uniform. A pair of compression socks. 2 pens with Cedar Creek Medical printed on the barrel. And, folded with military precision, the scrubs she'd worn on her last shift before the explosion. "Mom," Ryan said, and his voice cracked like he'd swallowed gravel, "I talked to General Hayes. He said you threw yourself over him. He said you saved his life and you lost your legs doing it, and now the hospital is firing you." Ryan was shaking his head, searching her face for an explanation that made sense. "The hospital laundry wouldn't even process your scrubs. The manager said they were contaminated. I had to get them from the regular trash. They were just throwing them away." Megan looked at those scrubs, folded, clean, sanitized through no fault of anyone but rendered disposable by proximity to her. The final indignity. The hospital had thrown away more than fabric. They'd thrown away the evidence. They'd thrown away the story. They'd thrown away her. She reached for the box, and her hands were steady, and she held those scrubs against her chest, and she didn't say a word. The rain started at 11:38 p.m. Megan sat on a bench at the downtown San Antonio bus station, the one on Commerce Street, 3 blocks from the hospital where her legs had stopped being legs. The rain hammered the pavement like it had a message to deliver. Her wheelchair was parked beside the bench, the temporary one, the hospital model, plastic and chrome and utterly impersonal. The prosthetics would come later, if insurance approved them, if she could afford the copay, if her physical therapy didn't get rejected by a claims adjuster who'd been trained by Caldwell's insurance fraud network to deny everything possible. She had $347 in her checking account. She had a cardboard box of belongings. She had the scrubs that nobody wanted and a tarnished challenge coin that sat in her palm like an accusation. The coin was worn, the serial numbers almost illegible, the eagle on one side reduced to a shadow. She'd carried this coin through Tikrit, through 3 firefights, through the night she'd pulled 3 Marines from a burning Humvee and made the choice that meant she'd never walk again. No, that wasn't right. She'd made the choice that meant she'd walked those Marines back to their families, back to their lives, and then she'd walked into a career that was supposed to matter, that was supposed to keep her on a path where her choices meant something. The rain was cold on her skin. She looked at the coin, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought about throwing it into the street, into the storm drain, into the past where it belonged. She thought about letting it go. She thought about the fact that nobody was watching, nobody cared, nobody would ever know if Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien decided to stop being who she'd always been. The rain ran down her face like tears, except soldiers didn't cry, so she didn't cry. She just sat there, and the rain fell, and the coin sat in her hand like the last proof that she'd ever been anything more than a night shift nurse at a corrupt hospital in San Antonio. And then she heard it. Distant at first, then growing closer, the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the rain-soaked air. Not the medevac birds. Not the routine flights from the medical center. This sound had a different cadence, a military rhythm, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of a Black Hawk's blades moving air like they were moving mountains. Megan's fingers closed around the coin. Her eye stayed fixed on the street ahead. The rotors grew louder. And then, cutting through the rain and the city noise and the usual midnight chaos of downtown San Antonio, she heard the squeal of tires and the rain-muffled sound of boots hitting pavement. 1, 2, 3, 4. Heavy boots. Combat boots. The sound of soldiers moving with purpose. A Navy SEAL in a dress uniform jogged toward the bus stop, water streaming off his shoulders, his face set with the specific intensity of someone executing an order. Behind him, a second soldier, then a third. They moved like they knew exactly where they were going and exactly who they were looking for. The SEAL who reached the bench first dropped to one knee in front of the wheelchair, and his eyes, dark, focused, the color of the ocean at dusk, met Megan's with the kind of recognition that came from shared pain and shared sacrifice. "Chief," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Angel 6. Megan said nothing. She didn't move. She held the challenge coin in her steady hand and watched the SEAL's face register that he'd found what he was looking for. The SEAL's radio crackled. A voice that didn't belong to Cedar Creek Medical answered. "Angel 6. Confirm visual." Megan's steady hand opened. The challenge coin caught the fluorescent light, tarnished silver, worn smooth from 7 years in her pocket. The seal's shoulders squared. Confirmed. Angel 6 is found. Within 60 seconds, the lobby filled with dress blues. Not hospital security. Not administration. The 160th SAW Night Stalkers had landed on the helipad 3 minutes earlier. Their boots echoed against Cedar Creek's polished floor like a countdown clock nobody else could hear. General Marcus Hayes wheeled himself into the conference room where the hospital board sat frozen, their coffee cups suspended mid-sip. Behind him walked 2 FBI agents, their credentials flashing like silver lightning. Caldwell wasn't in the room yet. He didn't know they were coming. The SEAL commander, call sign Breaker, found him in his private office on the 6th floor, hunched over his computer monitor. 3 personnel files were open. 2 were highlighted in red. 1 was in the process of being edited, sentences being deleted, dates being shifted backward. Caldwell was recreating Megan's employment history, carefully revising her hire date to remove her from the timeline of his most profitable billing season, building the paper trail that would prove she was never qualified, never certified, never supposed to be there. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Delete. 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 The hard drive was recording every keystroke. The FBI had been monitoring Caldwell's encrypted email server for 11 days, since General Hayes woke up and asked why his Navy nurse was suddenly gone. 1 phone call from a 4-star general to the Pentagon was all it took to open a federal fraud investigation. The second keystroke Caldwell made after the military walked in would be his last. Dr. Caldwell. Breaker's voice didn't ask questions. It delivered facts. You're under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, forgery of medical records, and obstruction of a federal investigation. You have the right to remain silent. Caldwell's face drained in stages, first white, then gray, then the color of old meat. His hands flew up. These files, there was a clerical error. The FBI agent moved toward him with handcuffs that clicked open like a promise. Let's go, Doctor. They didn't run the perp walk through the back. They walked him through the main corridor. 3rd floor. The ICU where his fraud had rotted. 2nd floor. The surgical wing where the explosion happened. Ground floor. The cafeteria. The same cafeteria where he'd announced his bet. The same cafeteria where he'd smiled while Megan's lunch tray scattered across the tile. The entire staff was standing. Nurses. Residents. Technicians. Even the cafeteria workers had lined up along the service counter. Caldwell's wrists were locked in stainless steel. His white coat was unbuttoned, swinging like a flag of surrender. His eyes darted left, then right, searching for someone, anyone, who might argue he belonged here. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was the sound of a network collapsing. Of lies meeting evidence. Of the quietest person in the room finally being seen. The U.S. attorney filed charges within 12 hours. 15 counts. Fraud. Forgery. Conspiracy. The digital evidence was immaculate, every forged entry timestamped, every fraudulent billing code traceable to his personal account. $2,300,000 extracted from insurance companies, funneled through shell corporations, converted into property purchases in 3 states and a vacation home in Baja, California. Caldwell's medical license was revoked before his bail hearing finished. The Texas Medical Board didn't debate. Didn't deliberate. They reviewed the evidence and signed the termination order with a pen that sounded like a gavel. 15 years was what the sentencing guidelines recommended. Caldwell's lawyer was already negotiating. But the real punishment came after. 6 months into his first year at federal detention, the Bureau of Prisons transferred him to San Antonio's work release program. Mandatory community service. He washed up in the gym at San Antonio Community College, tied an apron around his waist, and started teaching CPR certification to nursing students for $18 an hour. The name tag read Stephen. Not Doctor. Not Dr. Caldwell. Just Stephen. A man. An old man. Somebody's cautionary tale. When students asked about his background, he changed the subject. When they asked why his hand shook during the chest compression demonstrations, he said nothing. The challenge coin that Megan had carried, the one with a Marine's blood still visible in the grooves after 7 years, was now polished and mounted. Cedar Creek's lobby display case held it under glass, bracketed by brass rails, with a plaque beneath in letters that would never tarnish, "Courage isn't rank, it's character." The story was printed below, Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, Navy Special Warfare Command. 18 lives saved in Tikrit, 2017. Medical Service Commendation, 2015. The hospital had added a new wing, 8 acute care beds dedicated to wounded veterans, free of charge. Pro bono. No billing fraud. No kickbacks. No network of board members gaming the system. Just healing. A Marine courier arrived at her apartment on a Thursday morning. Cream-colored envelope. Heavy stock. The presidential seal embossed in gold foil. Her hands opened it the way they'd opened every piece of mail since the explosion, carefully, as if the paper might break. Inside, the President of the United States requests the honor of Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien's presence at the White House for the Medal of Honor ceremony. It was dated for 2 weeks out. The Medal of Honor. Not a commendation. Not a recognition. The highest military honor a civilian government could bestow. She set the letter down. Her hands, steady as surgical lasers, didn't shake. But something in her chest did. Something that had been locked down for 7 years, since Tikrit, since the Humvee fire, since the challenge coin was earned with blood and smoke. Since she'd chosen to be just a nurse so that people like General Hayes could come home. Her son Ryan found her on the porch that evening, sitting in the same chair where she'd waited for the SEAL team to land. He didn't ask questions. He sat down beside her. Neither of them spoke. That was enough. The ceremony was scheduled for the Rose Garden. 18 members of her unit from Tikrit flew in. General Hayes attended in his wheelchair, now walking with a prosthetic that Megan had helped choose. The Secretary of Defense read the citation aloud, the classified operations, the names of the soldiers who lived because her hands had moved faster than shrapnel, the moment she'd thrown her body over a general's open chest cavity and lost everything so he could keep his life. The President placed the ribbon around her neck. Light blue. White stars. The weight of it settled against her sternum like a truth finally spoken aloud. That night, walking back through the West Wing corridors with her son, Megan passed a mirror. She didn't recognize the woman in the dress uniform. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. The nursing scrubs were folded in her locker at Cedar Creek. She'd gone back 2 weeks after the ceremony. Not for recognition. Not for the promotion they'd offered her, Chief of Trauma Services, Corner Office, Administrative Authority. She'd declined it. Instead, she'd put on the scrubs and walked into the ICU. The nurses had stopped what they were doing. The doctors had stepped back. She'd simply nodded and moved to the bedside of a 23-year-old Marine with shrapnel wounds that matched her own timeline. Her hands had opened the fall line with the precision of muscle memory, and something inside her had settled. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 17 years of restraint. Of hiding. Of being underestimated. Of knowing exactly who you were while the world saw only what you chose to show them. The challenge coin still hung in its display case downstairs. Polished silver catching the light. The plaque beneath read the truth now, courage isn't rank, it's character. Megan O'Brien was going on night shift. She had patients who needed her. She had an ICU full of broken bodies and minds that required hands that had held their own breaking and simply kept moving. Not for medals. Not for recognition. For the same reason she'd thrown her body over General Hayes at 2:08 a.m. during an explosion that nobody was supposed to survive. Because that's what you do when everything is burning and someone still needs saving. That's what you do when the lights go out. We appreciate every one of you watching. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're tuning in from.